She confessed she was mute for 7 years, until the king's dying cub called her name. There is an old saying in the hill packs of Veldmoor, "A voice is not lost. It is only waiting to find someone worth the risk." Sable Voss had heard this saying exactly once, from her mother's mouth, in the last hour before her mother stopped breathing. She had been 9 years old, and the grief had swallowed her whole, swallowed her so completely that it took her voice with it, down into the dark, like a stone dropped into a winter well. 7 years passed. She learned to survive in silence. She learned that silence, worn correctly, could look like dignity rather than damage. She learned that in the pack of Ashenridge, a wolfless girl who could not speak was 1 tier above invisible, which was to say she was roughly as significant as the stones in the courtyard wall, useful for leaning against, otherwise unremarkable. She kept one thing from her mother's hands, a small river-worn button, smooth as a whispered secret, carved from pale bone. She kept it in her pocket every day. She pressed it between her thumb and forefinger when the world grew too loud, or too cold, or too much. She did not know, on the morning they loaded her into the cart with 3 other pack servants and drove her through the iron gates of Veldmoor's royal seat, that the silence was almost over. She did not know a dying child was waiting to end it. Chapter 1. The debt cart. The cart smelled of pine resin and old wool, and Sable sat at its far corner with her back straight and her hands folded, watching the forest change from the scrub oak thickets of Ashenridge into the deep, cathedral dark pines of the King's Reach. The other 3 servants were talking. They always talked when she was present, in the particular way people talk around someone they've decided isn't really listening, freely, carelessly, as if she were a piece of furniture that happened to have eyes. Rin, the laundress, was explaining the situation to the young stable boy, whose name Sable hadn't caught. "Ashenridge owes the king a debt levy. 3 years of missed tribute." She held up 3 fingers for emphasis. "So, instead of coin, they send warm bodies. Cook said it's only until the debt's cleared. A season, maybe 2. "What's wrong with the palace?" the stable boy asked. He couldn't have been more than 14, and his voice still cracked on the high notes of anxiety. Rin lowered her voice, which meant she raised it in the conspiratorial register that carries twice as far. "The king's son, the little one, Seren, 4 years old and burning alive, with some fever the pack healers can't name. They say he's been sick 3 months. The king..." She paused for dramatic weight. "They say the king doesn't sleep anymore. Just paces the corridors all night." Sable pressed the bone button in her pocket. She had heard the stories of King Kalen dressed. Most of the hillpacks had. He was the sort of king that legends accumulate around the way moss accumulates on stone, not because he sought legend, but because his nature seemed to demand it. He'd united 4 fractured packs under 1 crown without a single execution, which was either sainthood or sorcery, depending on who was telling the story. He was broad as an oak door and had eyes the gray of deep water, and he had buried his mate 2 years ago in the white cemetery on the hill above the palace. And now his son was dying. Sable looked out at the passing trees and felt, without quite understanding why, that she was traveling toward something important. Not toward danger. She was no stranger to danger and could recognize its particular weight in the air. This was something else. Something that felt the way the bone button felt. Small, smooth, and worth keeping. The iron gates of Drestmore Palace opened before the cart had fully stopped. Chapter 2. The House of Held Breath. The palace was not what she had expected. She had expected grandeur of the cold, performative kind, the kind that reminds you of your smallness at every turn. What she found instead was a house that had clearly, recently, known joy, and was now in the process of forgetting how. The stone corridors were wide and warm-lit with amber sconces. Children's drawings, rendered in charcoal and berry ink, were pinned to the wooden frames of doorways in the east wing. Someone had painted a wolf in blue paint on the bottom step of the back stair, small and cheerful, and slightly wrong in the proportion of its ears. All of it had the quality of flowers left in a vase too long, still present, starting to ache. A palace steward named Orvin sorted them quickly and without ceremony. The stable boy to the stables, Rin to the laundry, the third woman, older, a cook by trade, to the kitchen. Orvin looked at Sable last. She handed him the folded paper that Ashenridge's packmaster had sent with her. It listed her name, her debt levy status, and her skills: mending, herb work, general household duties. It did not mention that she was wolfless or silent, because the packmaster had not thought these details worth including in a ledger entry. Orvin read the paper with the expression of a man attempting arithmetic while tired. Herb work, he repeated. He looked at her more carefully for the first time. She was slight, dark-haired, 22, with the kind of still, attentive face that tends to make people uneasy when they can't determine whether the stillness is stupidity or intelligence. The healer's been asking for an extra pair of hands. You'll report to Wren in the East Wing sick room. He paused. The boys' rooms. You understand the situation? She nodded once, precisely. He seemed to take this for composure, which was near enough to the truth. She followed the directions he gave her, left, up 2 flights, through the carved door with the crescent moon, and found herself outside a room that smelled of yarrow and burning cedar and the specific silence of a place where people are afraid to make noise, as if sound itself might tip some terrible balance. She knocked softly, opened the door. The healer, Wren, was a compact woman of perhaps 50, with silver-streaked hair worn in a single braid, and dark circles ground so deeply into the skin beneath her eyes that they looked geological. She looked at Sable the way Orvin had, assessing quick, then looked past her as if expecting someone more. You're from Ashenridge? The herb hand? Sable nodded. I need someone to sit with him while I sleep 2 hours. Watch his breathing, cool the cloth on his forehead when it warms. Call me if... Wren stopped. Something shifted in her face as she watched Sable's careful stillness. Can you speak? Sable shook her head. She held up 2 fingers, then pointed at her throat, a gesture she had developed over years to explain without paper. Wren studied her for a moment. Then, to Sable's surprise, the healer's expression did not close off or recoil. It simply recalibrated. Can you get to me fast if something changes? Sable nodded and touched her feet. I can run, then made a knocking motion in the air. Good enough. Wren moved toward the inner door. Come and meet him. Chapter 3. Seren. He was so small. She had known, intellectually, that he was 4 years old. But intellectual knowledge and the actual sight of a 4-year-old lost inside a fever were different things entirely, and the difference hit Sable like a wave hitting a cliff, not destructively, but entirely. Seren dressed lay in a bed that was scaled to him, but still looked enormous in the way beds always look enormous when the person in them is ill. He had his father's gray eyes, she would learn later, but at that moment they were closed, the lids slightly lavender with exhaustion. His hair was dark and damp and stuck to his forehead in the shape of a question mark. He was breathing, shallow, careful little breaths, as if each one cost him something he was running short of. His hands, resting on the coverlet, were perfect. The hands of a child who had never had to use them for anything harder than drawing lopsided wolves on staircase walls. Wren gave her the instructions twice: cloth, water, temperature, the particular rattle in the breath that would mean run, and then disappeared through a side door to sleep, and Sable was alone with him. She pulled the chair close. She dipped the cloth. She laid it, cool and careful, across his forehead. His breathing eased by one small degree. She sat and watched him breathe, and turned the bone button in her pocket, and did not speak, because she hadn't spoken in 7 years, and she saw no reason to start now. But she thought very clearly, you need to stay. You need to stay, and grow up and draw more wolves. She thought it so clearly, it almost had a sound. She was there 3 hours before the door opened, and she became aware, with the particular animal awareness of someone who has learned to read rooms rather than faces, that the man who had just entered the room was enormous and exhausted, and in a state of grief so advanced, it had moved beyond expression into something structural, the way an old wound becomes part of the skeleton. King Kalen, dressed, stood in the doorway of his son's room and looked at her, the way he might look at a chair that had been moved without his knowing. Puzzled, not unkind. She stood immediately out of instinct and bowed her head slightly. He held up one hand. "Don't." The gesture was not imperious. It was tired. "Ren's girl?" She touched her chest, shook her head, then made the Ashenridge gesture, palm flat, extended toward the floor as if indicating distant geography. He understood enough. "Debt levy." He looked at his son. Something passed across his face that was too large and too private to name. He sat in the chair on the far side of the bed, and it was clear from the way he sat, from the exact angle of his shoulders, and the way his hands found the armrests with the certainty of long habit, that he had spent many, many hours in this chair. Sable settled back into her own chair on the opposite side. She resumed cooling the cloth. Neither of them spoke, which in her case was not unusual, and in his case seemed to be a relief rather than an absence. They kept watch together for another hour. The candles burned down. Seren breathed his careful, costly breaths. Kalen, dressed, watched his son with gray eyes that had the quality of deep water, not still exactly, but moving too deep to see the motion. Once, without looking at her, he said, "He was talking 2 months ago, constantly. He never stopped." A pause. "I keep expecting him to say something." She looked at him across the small, fever-warm body of his son, and she understood this so precisely that it hurt. "So do I," she thought. "I know exactly what that is." She pressed the bone button through the fabric of her pocket and said nothing. Chapter 4. The Language of Staying. A week passed. She was assigned to the sick room permanently, Ren recognizing, with a healer's practicality, that the boy slept more steadily when Sable was present, which was worth more than philosophy about why. She developed a rhythm with Ren built on gesture and written notes, and the small, precise vocabulary of caring for someone very ill. This herb, this temperature, this sign. Ren was brusque in the way of people who have no patience for performance, but she was not unkind, and she treated Sable's silence as a simple fact of the landscape rather than a deficiency to work around. With Kalen, the rhythm was different. He came at unpredictable hours, sometimes in the deep of night, sometimes in the blue early morning while the palace was still gathering itself. He always sat in the same chair. He sometimes talked in the fragmentary way of someone thinking aloud to the only witness he'd permitted himself, and Sable listened the way she had always listened, completely, without the reflex to respond that clutters most listening. He talked about Seren's mother, Mira, once, briefly, obliquely, the way people mention a wound by touching the place beside it rather than the wound itself. He said she had given Seren his laugh. He said the laugh had been the loudest thing in any room it entered. He did not look at Sable while he said this. He was looking at his son. She wrote on her small notepad. She kept it always in her other pocket, the one without the button. He still has her eyes. I can see that much even closed. She tore the page and set it at the edge of the bed where he could see it. He read it. Something happened in his face. Not quite a smile, not quite tears, but the place where both of them live. "You're observant," he said. She spread her hands. "What else is there to be?" He looked at her then, truly looked, with the particular quality of attention he usually reserved for his son, as if he were deciding whether she was real. She held his gaze without flinching, because she had learned a long time ago that flinching away from being seen was how you ended up invisible. After that, the notes became a habit, not just medical observations, small things. He moved his left hand before he woke this morning. I think that's new. Or after Sable had slipped down to the kitchen and returned. Cook sent broth with copper root. She says it's her mother's recipe. She seems to believe very strongly in her mother's recipe. The second note made him make a sound that was almost a laugh, bitten back and swallowed, as though he'd forgotten it was still in him and was surprised to find it there. She watched him notice his own surprise. She looked quickly back at Seren to give him the privacy of it. Outside the sick room, the rest of the palace viewed her with the customary blend of pity and unease she had grown accustomed to over 7 years. The wolfless mute from Ashenridge, rattling around the king's house. Rin had apparently been talking about Sable's silence, about her wolflessness, about the debt levy's strange assignment of such a girl to the king's sick room. The whispers moved through the servants' quarters like water finding cracks. Sable heard them. She had always been very good at hearing things people said in her presence, on the assumption she didn't count. She pressed her bone button and went back to her work. Chapter 5. The Ninth Night. On the 9th night of her posting, Seren's fever spiked. Sable was there alone, Ren catching her allotted sleep, Kaelin in some unavoidable meeting with pack representatives who had traveled 2 days to confer with the king and could not be put off again. The fever climbed in the way of fevers in small bodies, rapidly, with terrible confidence, while the sufferer himself seemed to recede rather than struggle, as if the illness were simply filling the space he vacated. Sable did everything Ren had told her. Cooled cloths applied in sequence, the particular herb water brewed from the bundles she kept at the ready. The measured drops of fever break tincture, administered with a precision her hands had always possessed even when everything else felt imprecise. The fever climbed anyway. She ran for Ren. Back in a minute. Ren arrived at a controlled sprint that spoke of years of practice, assessed quickly, began the secondary protocol. 3 different preparations. Specific pressure applied at points along the neck and jaw to assist the pack healer's method she'd learned from the Eastern Territory. Sable was her second pair of hands, efficient, unhesitating, no need for instruction on the things they'd established, and quick to read the pointing of Ren's eyes for the things she didn't know yet. They worked for 2 hours. The fever broke at the 3rd hour of the morning, at the exact moment that Kaelin dressed shouldered through the door, still wearing his formal meeting clothes, having apparently abandoned the pack representatives somewhere between protocol and terror. He looked at his son, at the cooling skin, at the slightly easier breath. He looked at Sable and Ren, both disheveled, both exhausted, both still in the particular ready crouch of people who haven't let themselves believe it's over yet. Ren said, "The fever broke. It's not finished, but this night we won." She said it with the blunt satisfaction of a craftsperson who has done their best work under the worst conditions. Kaelin made a sound, not words, just sound, and sat down very suddenly in the small chair, which creaked under the sudden, complete weight of a man who had just allowed his legs to give out. Sable moved quietly to the side table and poured water and brought it to him, because that was what was needed. He took the cup and held it in both hands, though he didn't drink, and after a moment he said, "Thank you." He looked up at her from the chair, and she saw that his eyes were wet, which he was not attempting to hide, and she thought, "There it is. There is the person underneath the king." She nodded. She turned back to Seren, to the steady, slightly easier breathing, and let the moment settle without making it large. Chapter 6. The Name He Called. 3 days after the fever broke, Seren opened his eyes. Not for the first time since the illness, he had drifted into wakefulness, and out again throughout her posting, occasionally taking water or broth from her hands, or from his father's, without full consciousness, just the bodily instinct for sustenance. But this was different. This was intentional. This was a small boy deciding to come back. He looked at the ceiling for a while. Then he looked at his father, who was there and awake, and had been awake for a long time. Then he turned his head and looked at Sable. She was sitting in her chair with her notepad, writing down his morning observations for Ren. She looked up and found his gray eyes, his father's eyes, open and focused, and aimed at her with the pure, uncomplicated directness that belongs exclusively to small children and very old animals. "You were here," he said. His voice was rusted from disuse, but entirely present. "You were always here." She looked at him, and the bone button was in her hand. She didn't remember reaching into her pocket, but there it was, smooth between her fingers. "I heard you," he said in the manner of a child reporting a fact of no particular significance. "When it was dark, you were talking to me." She went completely still. "You said I had to stay," he said. "You said I had to stay and draw more wolves." He considered this for a moment with the solemnity of someone reviewing an important agreement. "I do like wolves." She had thought it. She had thought it so clearly it almost had a sound, on the first night, alone with him. She had not said it. She was certain she had not said it. And yet, "Can you talk?" he asked because he was 4, and therefore asked the thing directly, without preamble. She opened her mouth to shake her head, the way she had shaken her head for 7 years, the practiced reflex of it already in motion. And a sound came out. Not a word. Not yet. Just a sound. The sound that lives at the very beginning of speech. The indrawn breath that precedes a word. The aperture opening after 7 years of being closed. She felt it the way you feel a window opening in a room that has been shut too long. The rush of changed pressure. The sudden awareness of what the air could be. Her hand went to her throat. Kaelin had gone perfectly still across the bed. Siren looked at her with the patient, attentive expression of someone waiting for what comes next. "Sable," she said, her own name. The first word in 7 years, and she gave it to him like an answer to his question, because it was the only word she was sure of. She existed. She was here. She was someone who could be called by a name. The sound of it, the sound of her own voice, strange and raw and slightly cracked from disuse, like a door with stiff hinges, bounced off the stone walls and came back to her, and she sat with it in her hands, not knowing what to do with something she'd believed was gone. Siren smiled. It was a considerable smile for a 4-year-old who had been unconscious for most of the month. "I like that name," he decided. "It sounds like something." She made a sound that was half laugh, half something else entirely, something that had no name because it was the specific feeling of a 7-year-old silence ending in a sick room in the early morning, while a small boy approved of your name. She looked up and found Kaelin watching her. Not with the expression she might have feared, not shock or the particular pity of witnessing a private unraveling. He was watching her with the gray water eyes at full depth, and his expression was one she had begun to recognize over these weeks. The expression of a man who was seeing something real and was determined not to look away from it. Chapter 7. What was waiting? The next days moved differently. Speech, as it turned out, did not simply return in full the moment the wall cracked. It came back the way circulation returns to a limb that's been numb, in increments, with strange sensations, with the occasional jolt of something that felt like pain and was actually just aliveness. She told Ren first. Quietly, in the early morning, testing words with the same careful attention she gave to testing herbs. "I can speak. I don't know how much. I don't know how steady." Ren received this with her characteristic brisk non-ceremony, squeezing Sable's shoulder once and hard, like a period at the end of a sentence that needed punctuation. She told Kaelin on the 4th day after Siren's waking. She wrote it first. Old habit. And then, while he was reading the note, she said it aloud, too, so the note and the voice arrived together. He was quiet for a long time. 7 years. Not a question. He was processing the mathematics of it. 7 years of silence in the palace, against the weeks she'd spent here, against the distance between those two quantities. "My mother died," she said. Her voice still had the quality of something new to its own existence, hesitant, slightly wondering at itself. "I was 9. I didn't—" She touched her throat because even now the full explanation existed more clearly in gesture than in sound. "It didn't come back." "Until now?" "Until your son told me he'd heard me." She paused. "I wasn't speaking. I was only thinking. But he heard it anyway." Something moved through his expression that was too complex to disassemble. "He does that," he said, with the particular tone of a parent who has been surprised by their child before and expects to be surprised again. Mira said he was like that from the beginning. She said he had ears for things that don't make sound. His voice was even, but she heard the grief in the architecture of it, the way he kept Mira in present tense out of love and then corrected to past out of honesty, and how that correction cost him every time. She sounds like she saw clearly, Sable said. He looked at her. She did. A beat. You do too. The space between them shifted in the way of spaces where something true has been said, and both people know it. She did not look away. Neither did he. And the quality of being looked at, truly, specifically, as Sable Voss, and not as the wolfless mute from Ashenridge, not as a debt levy servant, not as a convenient silence in the corner of a sick room, was something she felt from her sternum outward, the way heat moves from a fire through stone. Over the following weeks, as Seren recovered with the resilient absurdity of small children, she talked to him in the careful, inventoried way of someone spending a currency they'd been saving without purpose for years. She answered his questions about herbs. She told him small stories about the hill packs, the ones her mother had told her. She described the shapes of clouds in the language she'd spent 7 years developing internally, where everything had a precise and slightly unusual name. Seren, for his part, treated her voice as if it had always been there, which was perhaps the most grace anyone had ever extended her. Kaelin heard her voice most often in passing at first, in the corridor outside the sick room, in the kitchen where she was beginning to venture, in the small walled garden where she went in evenings to gather her thoughts among growing things. And then one evening he came to the garden too, not accidentally, and they sat together on the stone bench near the rosemary hedge and talked for 2 hours about nothing and everything, about the hill packs, about the nature of the land that connected them, about what it felt like to carry something missing, and whether the carrying itself became a kind of home. He asked toward the end of the evening, "What will you do when the debt's cleared?" She looked at the rosemary. She said slowly, honestly, "I don't know. I've never made a plan that assumed I'd have a voice by the time I arrived at it." The look he gave her then was the one she thought about afterward, in the dark, pressing the bone button between her fingers. Not the look of a king deciding a question of policy, but the look of a man who has found something in a place he'd stopped expecting to find things, and is afraid of the precision of his own wanting. "Stay," he said. "Not as debt levy. As... I need a word." "So do I," she admitted, and the smile that broke over her face was the first smile in 7 years that was visible rather than merely internal, and she felt it arrive like a door opening, like a window, like an aperture, the rush of changed pressure, and the sudden knowledge of what the air could be. Chapter 8. The word they found. The debt levy cleared at the end of the 2nd month. Ashenridge sent the formal paperwork with a messenger who seemed mildly surprised to find the wolfless mute he was technically there to collect standing in the palace kitchen, teaching Seren to identify yarrow by smell, speaking in a voice that was still slightly unused sounding, but entirely, unmistakably present. The packmaster had apparently expected her back, and the paperwork included a kind of offhand proprietary note that Kaelin read once, then placed very deliberately face down on his desk. He went to find her in the kitchen. "You don't have to go," he said. "I've written to Ashenridge. Your debt is cleared and your residency here is extended by the king's request, if you're willing." She looked at him across the kitchen table, Seren sitting between them with a bunch of yarrow held to his nose like a bouquet, very satisfied with himself. "If I'm willing," she repeated. "I'm trying," he said carefully, "not to be a king about this. I'm trying to ask." She understood the effort this was, understood it in the specific way of someone who had also spent years learning to inhabit less space than they deserved, to ask nothing, to need nothing visible. She understood it so exactly that it moved her. "Then yes," she said, "I'm willing." Seren looked up at both of them with the expression of a 4-year-old who has been following this conversation on a frequency slightly above its apparent content, and said, "Good," with great finality, and went back to smelling his yarrow. Over the following months, she found the word, or rather they found it together, the way you find something you weren't looking for when you stop looking for the wrong thing. It started in the sick room and moved to the garden, and from the garden to the library, and from the library to every room in the palace that was large enough for two people to occupy comfortably and become gradually unaware of their separateness. The word, when it arrived in the old way the best words arrive. Not announced, not declared, but simply present one morning, as if it had always been there, and they'd only just learned to read it. It was home. And then it was mine. And then it was both at once, which has a different word, and that word, spoken for the first time in the small walled garden by the rosemary hedge, while the last light went amber over the pine-dark King's Reach, she said aloud, in her still slightly new voice, to a man with gray water eyes who had stopped expecting things and started again to find them. He said it back. The rosemary smelled like a beginning. Epilogue. 1 year later. A voice is not lost. It is only waiting to find someone worth the risk. She said this in the small, stone-walled room adjacent to the library, to the 7 women gathered there, all of them silent in various ways, for various reasons brought to Drestmore from 5 different pack territories, at the quiet arrangement of the Queen herself, who had become something of a rumor in the hill packs. The wolfless woman, the voiceless woman, who now spoke with the full weight of the palace behind her words. She said it standing at the front of the room with her hands at her sides, comfortable in her own stillness in a way she had never been comfortable in it before, because now the stillness was chosen, not imposed. The 7 women had the look she recognized, the careful, inward expression of people who have learned to occupy less space than they deserve. She had been fluent in that expression for 7 years. She could still read it perfectly. "I know what silence sounds like from the inside," she said. Her voice had gained its full register now, warm and low, with the occasional trace of its own history, in the slight roughness that never quite left it. She had grown to love the roughness. It reminded her where the voice had been, and why it had stayed there, and what had called it home. "I'm not here to take yours from you before you're ready. I'm here to tell you, something will be worth it. Someone will be worth it. And when it happens, you'll know." In the back row, a girl of perhaps 17 with the terrified composure of someone holding themselves together purely by force of will, looked up at her with eyes that had the precise quality of a winter well, deep and dark, and containing something that hadn't moved in a long time. Sable held her gaze without flinching, because this was how you helped. You looked at someone until they understood that being looked at was survivable, was good, even. Afterward, in the corridor, Seren found her, because Seren always found her. He had a particular gift for locating people who had just done something emotionally significant, and materializing with some completely practical demand, which was its own kind of grace. "Come see," he said, taking her hand. "I drew a wolf. Papa says it's very good." "Does it have the right number of ears this time?" He considered. "Mostly." She let him pull her down the corridor toward the room where his drawings were pinned in chronological order along the eastern wall. She had suggested this several months ago, as a way of letting him see his own progression, and he had embraced it with an archivist's passion that made Kaelin laugh every time he passed the gallery. Kaelin was there now, in the doorway, and he looked at her with the full weight of the gray water eyes and the slightly one-sided expression that she had learned was what a smile looked like on a man who had forgotten he could make one, and was now relearning. How did it go? It went. She leaned into the warmth of him, easy and settled, the way you lean against something you have tested and found solid. Seren was already explaining the wolf's technical merits to neither of them in particular. She reached into her pocket, not the notepad pocket, the other one, and found the bone button, smooth as a whispered secret, worn to a shine by 7 years of fear, and then 1 year of something entirely different. She held it in her hand without the urgency, without the need. Her mother had said, "A voice is not lost. It is only waiting to find someone worth the risk." Her mother had been right, and more generous than she'd known, because it had not turned out to be only one someone. It had turned out to be a 4-year-old who drew wolves, a healer with geological dark circles and exactly no patience for performance, a king who had learned to ask instead of command, and the 7 women in the stone room, and the girl in the back row with the Winterwell eyes, and every person after that who might sit in that room and hear the saying and find their way to the particular courage of the first sound. The voice was not lost. It had been waiting, and the world it came home to was worth every year of the waiting, and then some. End.